Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. On behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we would like to thank all of our sponsors who have continued to support the symposium during this very challenging year. Before we thank our partners, we'd like to ask that sometime during the symposium's breaks that you visit our partners' virtual booths. You can also visit the Content Hub on the MIT CDOIQ website for some great partner resources. We'd like to thank the following partners: Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy Analytics, DAWEX, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Sandal Consultants, Tamer, Elation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Okera, Pylog, Click, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global IDs, Snowflake, Starburst. And as I said, please make every effort to visit our partners, use the virtual passport, because without them and our partner support, the symposium could not be held. Thank you. Companies need to rethink data governance in the cloud first, a new remote working environment. So Nong Li, let me take it over and pass it over to you. And by the way, just one last question or one last point. For people that want to ask questions, please put your questions in the Slido form, and then we'll review the questions at the end. Thank you. Over to you, Nong Li.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Let me make sure my screen is shared and everything is good. Awesome, please let me know if you have trouble seeing my screen. Yeah, so I'm excited to be here today to talk about how to think about governance and securing data access at scale for large enterprises. I think today, probably particularly in this group, we all recognize the value of an effective and efficient data strategy for large organizations, but the security and governance implications of that and how to do that well is a problem we see again and again across our customers and broader user base. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. So just quickly, a little bit about myself. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Okera. We started the company about 4.5 years ago. I actually have my roots in Boston, growing up in Newton and going to school in New England, go Celtics. And then in my prior life, I spent a lot of time on building some of the core analytics technologies in the open source communities, particularly when I was at Cloudera and then at Databricks, leading some of those efforts. And I'm one of the original creators of Apache Parquet. So in terms of overall enterprise data strategy, I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here. We really at Okera see it as a holistic problem that has multiple independent moving parts. And really the complexity is making sure that all of them work coherently together and that all of the requirements across them are satisfied. I'm sure those of you here who are data practitioners yourself, building platforms like this, this should probably resonate with you pretty strongly. So in terms of the building a data platform and your overall data strategy and ecosystem, there's a bunch of things that go in here that's just not about the data itself, right? There's the core technologies in terms of the storage systems you pick, the analytics tools that you have brought onto your platform. But equally important are the various users that need to get involved, right? This really is an organizational-wide effort. The use cases that are going to drive your business, we don't want to boil the ocean and focus on the problems that are most impactful. And then obviously a trend that we've seen over certainly the last year, if not longer, and expect to accelerate, are the regulatory and overall privacy concerns in terms of how organizations should be able to store, use, and think about data for their customers and users and so on and so forth. So this entire set of inputs and requirements make this problem quite complicated, particularly when you think about security and governance as applied throughout the entire enterprise. So this is the landscape that we usually think about when we work with our clients and see how we can help. And our core belief is that security should really enable agility, right? There's going to be this fundamental tension between what seems like you're moving fast, i.e. just give everybody who wants data exactly what he or she wants, connect with whatever tools they're looking for, so on and so forth, right? If we stereotype a little bit, that might be the data consumer, kind of the analyst, data scientist, and their focus is on just kind of how do I leverage the data as fast as possible using whatever tool I am best trained in. On the other side, we want to be responsible about this. So for us, we usually think of that as the data producer or data steward that has the responsibility of proper use, making sure that the company is following certainly the regulations, but also the standards they have established within their organization on proper data use. And related to that are problems of making sure that the right people have access to the right things, that this approval process or data access process can be done quickly and efficiently, right? Again, to support the business. And then to also have understanding of what those policies are, what implications of changes to those policies are, and just a broader, better understanding of how the data estate is being consumed, right? We'll go to a lot of customers and users that we talk to that have a hard time understanding how the data platform is being consumed currently. And again, kind of an analogy I like to use is that, seat belts and better brakes let cars drive faster, right? And I think that metaphor is extremely apt. Having the proper controls, guardrails, security primitives that are powerful, easy to understand, easy to implement, really actually enable you to have much faster agility. And I think as we think about the macro trends that we're all seeing, obviously starting with COVID and more users working remotely out of the corporate network, as well as the direction that I feel regulations and privacy concerns will go, we're going to need more of those kind of guardrails while continuing to let data consumers move quickly. So we really see kind of this security capability, being able to manage data access at scale as being a critical component to helping data platforms be successful. So, if we were to just break this problem down one a little deeper, what we see is across the different user personas that are part of the data ecosystem at large organizations, security is an issue that all of them need to deal with, and a good solution should think about all of them and make sure all of their requirements are met. So what we hear very, very common is the teams or users who have put on their data governance and privacy hat have struggles with understanding if the organization is currently in compliance, right? It's very hard to understand typically, is all the PII protected correctly? Are we storing them in places where they're approved? How do I get confidence that we're doing the right thing here? Similarly, for data stewards and owners, they have very valuable data sets that can really power the business to innovate, right? Build new data applications, enable new analytics, so on and so forth. And how do they do that? By giving access to the data scientists, the users doing analytics. How do they do that easily without being seen as a bottleneck that prevents them from being productive with their jobs? Common to us, for the IT and data platform owners, they're often the bottleneck because a lot of the existing mechanisms and technologies to give data access is very IT-centric, meaning they require an extremely high level of technical expertise, whether that is at a minimum, great kind of data SQL expertise, or very commonly, and what we see, requires big data, distributed systems, quite advanced skill sets to provide that access. And that what that often happens is IT being the bottleneck because just the mechanics of provisioning access requires deep technical expertise and planning and so forth. And they're often resource constrained and seen as the bottleneck. And then lastly, the users that really need their hands on it are often frustrated because this entire process is very time consuming and often what ends up happening, not maliciously, is to find an alternate way to get what they need. And what we see, and I alluded to this a little bit, is three consistent challenges or trade-offs that organizations have to make trying to solve this problem. And all of these trade-offs have a very unpleasant downside that that ends up being prohibitive as the data platform grows in adoption. So the first is inconsistent policies. What we often see here is this particular BI tool has the proper governance and security controls, so that one is blessed. If you use that, great. But if you try to use a different tool, right, you're trying to experiment with a machine learning technique or something else, then you're not able to enforce the policies the same way, and you have the follow-on set of challenges. The second is reducing it to the lowest common denominator, right? So most of the tools in the ecosystem can probably talk to one common storage medium, right? Say S3 if you're in the cloud, but that doesn't provide the right granularity for you, right? Basically, the lowest common denominator storage technologies don't have the proper data governance capabilities, and that causes you to make some very difficult trade-offs. And then lastly, sort of an iteration on the previous approach is to make a lot of copies of the data, essentially a copy for every data policy that the organization has. And we've seen in some places a very large explosion in the number of copies on the order of hundreds as they basically need to materialize the policy and derive copies. And again, while that may work for a very, very small number, the explosion and maintenance complexity becomes extremely high. So in summary, all of these lead to really, really big scaling challenges. And our experience is that the complexity scales quite quickly, right? It's very, a system that is 10 times as complex on the dimensions is much more than 10 times as complicated to maintain because of all the interrelated interactions. So for us at Okera, we really think there is 3 core building blocks that are essential to solving this problem well and making sure that whatever you build can help you solve your problems today, but also sets you on the proper path to scale, as the success of your data platform is going to drive more users, more data sets, more use cases, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail and some use cases that we have seen where we were able to help our customers do this part really well. So the first is attribute-based access control. This is a policy modeling approach that up-levels the abstraction for which you define policies. We think this is critical and very powerful. The second, we believe strongly, is to solve this problem well, you need dynamic policy enforcement, meaning that I, as an end user, can change the policies, and the next time somebody accesses this data set on a single source of truth, they're going to be able to see the appropriate view. That dynamism we have experienced as being required to solve this problem well and generally. And then those first two tied together really map to a concept that we think of as distributed stewardship, which ties together some of the technology capabilities in 1 and 2, but also how to think about this a little bit organizationally, how you can scale out your solution for a proper data governance and security strategy. So for attribute-based access control, the real key concept here is that policy should be expressed closer to the business level logic, abstracted away from how the data is physically stored. So this is in contrast to what's been broadly available in the RWMS industry for decades, ABAC, role-based access control. So in the prior model, ABAC, you typically define policies on specific tables or specific columns in tables, and that means a lot of redundant policies that really mean the same thing, right? If you have user email addresses in 500 different tables, that's 500 different policies that you need to define and maintain. And it's very laborious and error-prone and unflexible, right? It's quite a high amount of maintenance every single time. ABAC, on the other hand, abstracts this away and lets you express something that is more aligned with your business policy, right? The way I describe that policy just in English is we want to protect data that has email, right? Not here are the 500 column names that we're trying to protect. So this maps much better to the business rules, the governance rules, and the regulations and extremely powerful. There are some other benefits related to this, and critically, the one I think is most impactful is that it can split up the responsibility between the users in the organization that are responsible for creating policies, right? Those are experts in regulations and privacy and concepts like that, from the users who need to be experts in the data. And those typically tend to be the product owners, the data teams producing the data sets, so on and so forth. So by splitting those two responsibilities up, it lets the organization scale much better. You don't need to be that person who can understand both to be successful in policy management. So that's the core part and principle of ABAC, but there's some very natural extensions that we think are really helpful in scaling this thing out. So I talked about data attributes. That's essentially the column in the middle in this picture, but equally powerful and complementary to this are user attributes and environment attributes. And we collectively think of that as the access request. So user attributes, I think many of us are probably experienced with LDAP or systems like that maintain where a user is in the organization and other metadata like that. And similarly for environment attributes, again, particularly in the world we're in right now, where people are working all over, can capture things like, is the request being made from somebody who's in the office or where they are physically in the world, and combine all of that in a very rich policy decision. So in some of the detail that we have on this slide, we would be very easily able to express a policy such as granting a set of users who are based in Europe access to European data, except that data that's sensitive must be tokenized, right? So we can very easily express high-level business logic like that. And I would say, example we've seen earlier, just broadly, is probably in the federal security space and their classification levels, and how that's been able to help them scale policy management very broadly. So as a little bit of a concrete example, so I talked about how with traditional ABAC technologies, you might have a very high explosion of roles and policies. So what you see in the left is a role for every user in every region. And you can imagine the maintenance challenge here. Whereas with attribute access control and thinking about it that way, this can be expressed as a single rule, regardless of how many levels you have in the organization or how many countries you have data in. So I want to walk through one of our use case examples where one of our clients has been able to implement this extremely effectively, working with us closely to get to this solution. So their challenge is they want to protect varying levels of sensitive data for their cloud data lake, right? A problem we hear very commonly. And where they are is they expect the initial use cases to be stood up, and then very quickly onboarding over the next 2 quarters, bringing on many more users, tools, and data. And their approach to this was to build this foundation of access management using ABAC from the start, so that subsequent tool and user onboarding can be really easy. The solution that we worked with them on is effectively they have 4 policies that are able to govern the vast majority of access rules across all of these storage technologies and thousands upon thousands of data sets. So for them, they've classified the data as being public, private, restricted, and confidential. And those in turn map to more specific tags, such as email address, phone number, so on and so forth, but really that kind of CIA style or CIA style policy management. So just those 4, and they're able to use these to broadly set policies that map to their business requirements. And as part of building this early on into the data fabric, it means when they onboard new data sets from new teams, new storage systems, so on and so forth, they simply have to map the contents in there to those 4 defined policies that's well understood throughout the business. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how much easier it is to reason about 4 policies versus 4,000. And this is a dramatic simplification in their approach. And again, secondly, one of the main benefits of this, and this customer is using it extremely well, is that it changes the constant maintenance of data policies or access policies from a data curation problem, i.e., do I have the right tags and the right workflow to manage those, and not a policy update workflow. Right? Policy updates, in our experience, are much more complicated to think about, much rarer typically, and the data attribute curation issue, right? Are these columns properly tagged? Is one that is much more scalable and easier for other teams to participate in. And then lastly, again, kind of attributes, the attribute management is critical. So we've also been able to seamlessly integrate with their enterprise data catalog, in this case, Calibra, that helps with the tag management, curation, a very complementary strategy that fits holistically with their overall data strategy. So moving on to the next key component for scalable access is dynamic policy enforcement. So at the core of this, our belief is we should have one single source of truth that contains the data in as clear text as possible, and that users that are querying the data are able to see a dynamic view that is appropriate for their permissions, right? So for example, some users should only be able to see a subset of the columns. Some users may only be able to see after certain values are filtered out, and other users can see the data, but only after they've been transformed in some anonymization technique. And again, this ties very well with attribute-based access control that I just talked about, where we can make this policy dynamic. This is in contrast to making multiple copies of that same data set statically, again, because the complexity of managing that is quite high. This combination, right, dynamically policies and ABAC, can solve examples that we see customers struggle with. For example, a particular data set has a comment column, right? Something you would think has no PII, may not be that interesting, but upon further investigation, realize customers often will put their passwords in that field, right? This free form text field, and the ability to then tag that automatically as something that should be restricted, and then having the policy engine be able to dynamically enforce it the next time any user is trying to read that data set is extremely powerful. Now, core to the dynamic policy enforcement is an assumption of performance, throughput, scalability, and making sure that that problem is well solved. But that is, I think, a difficult but well understood engineering problem. So again, another example of one of our clients that are really leveraging dynamic policies at a very, very high scale. So their primary challenge where they're using this is the GDPR requirement for data de-identification based on some interpretation of user consent. Meaning, if I want to opt my behavior for marketing, then you should not use my data anymore, right? So it's a very it's highly dynamic in the sense that a user could go onto this website, their website, and say, forget me now. And the next time that their analytics teams are processing, they should technically not see that user at all, right? So this completely rules out really any static approaches as the user list constantly changes. The volume here is tremendously high in production with hundreds to low thousands of data pipelines that they need to support, thousands of users that range the spectrum from more the data analysts to power users using the data science platforms. And the scale and just the data volume is tremendously high. So the solution that we work with them on is a join-based dynamic filtering rule, right? Think of the users that have opted out as a blacklist that must be dynamically evaluated and filtered out before the data is returned to end users. And to handle scalability, there's a very horizontally scalable big data style data plane that's doing the enforcement for the required throughput. And some of the benefits that they're realizing with this is having these dynamic policies is critical, right? The user blacklist list can constantly change, but at the same time for them, what they wanted to do in terms of de-identification, right? What's the proper way to de-identify age or physical location, things like that are changing. And over the course of the years that we've worked with them, we've observed that their privacy teams have mandated different requirements. And this dynamic nature, even at these tremendous data volumes, gives them that flexibility to adjust it as needed in a way that's completely transparent to the users reading the data sets. And lastly, they saw a dramatic reduction in the number of people required to implement security to access. Right? The prior solution was that very heavy ETL-focused, static, making copies, requiring a sizable team to manage a very small number of data sets, and certainly have never looked back. And the people savings is quite significant. And then lastly, just kind of as additional benefit from thinking about the problem a little bit more holistically is unifying access management, unifying how the data is accessed, lets you implement some more advanced and interesting use cases like cost controls and chargeback and detecting rogue data sets and derived data sets and so on and so forth. And at the same time, letting them onboard new technology teams much easier. So this is a perfect example of where solving the hard security problems initially helps them be more agile as they onboard additional users and use cases. And then tying those two together is a principle that we think of as distributed stewardship. And really it consists of two parts. So for us, we believe strongly that stewardship of the data, managing its security and access is a shared responsibility on the organization, and the technologies and approaches should help align to that, right? To help the organization scale in terms of how it solves this problem. And we see it really in two core goals. So the first is delegating the responsibility. So I spent some time talking about attribute-based access control and how that can split up the responsibility between policy experts and data content experts, right? That's an example of being able to spread that out. And then if we look at kind of some of the large organizations we typically work with, it's being able to push some of these responsibilities into the line of business, all right, meaning that a particular business unit or part of the organization can fully manage the data and policies in their domain with some amount of central guidance. So that ability to delegate and then push down. And then second is replicating. What we have seen overwhelmingly be successful is organizations that start with, say, one business unit or some of the critical use cases and understand how to do this. And this is solving problems related to access management, but typically broader, right? Typically that first phase of data platform rollout. And we want to make sure that whatever learnings, whatever policies and best practices have been set there can then be replicated to the other parts of the business unit, right? So that's how we're going to help the organization scale on how it thinks about this problem. Oops. Yeah, so to summarize, this is a lot of what I just talked about, but secure data access is a shared problem. There is a technology aspect of this, as well as an organizational and overall data strategy that helps everybody contribute to where the organization wants to go. And then distributed stewardship is really about breaking the problem up, right? Those are most knowledgeable about what he or she is empowered to do, is able to do it. It gives the organization a knob in terms of controlling what aspects of this can be centralized and what cannot be, and then can really accelerate the implementation of a system like this across the organization. So if we think about this more visually as a delegate, right? I am the central admin, maybe I am the CDO, and I'm able to split it up to, in this case, the line of the HR portion of the company, who can have somebody who is sort of leading that effort, and splitting up the responsibility that way. And as I work it out for the best practices that's consistent with our company policies, we can then replicate those best practices and learnings across to other parts. So that's how we think about distributed stewardship applied. So I think for us, understanding this is really marrying the technology capabilities and how it breaks up the problem, again, with the organizational model that lets you scale and have remove bottlenecks as the platform is more broadly adopted. And thinking about it this way helps you also think which parts of the workflow for which personas can we find better ways to automate and accelerate. So as an example of one of our customers that are starting to really leverage this is a large pharma company that we work with. So their initial challenge is protecting sensitive data for a clinical trial R&D use case, right? One part of the business, looking at clinical data for new drug delivery. And so I'll go horizontally this time. The solution we focused on is helping them define these very scalable policies for data in S3, enabling the specific set of data science tools that they were looking for. And of course, the benefit here is the clinical trial, in their words, is the crown jewels as it powers growth in the top line business. As we got this first implementation and problem solved, they've started and planning to accelerate the adoption of their platform across the entire organization. So instead of just R&D, it is HR use cases, it is manufacturing use cases, it is various other, they have about a dozen top-level domains like this, and they want to extend the platform to capture that. So the solution for us, working domain admin, right? What does it mean to not be the central role and responsibility for the entire organization, but how do we push the responsibilities, keep them isolated from each other, sharing what we should share across the different business units as they scale out. And of course, this is really helping them accelerate their enterprise-wide data platform strategy. So I think I've got a couple of minutes. So just kind of wrapping up, the data strategy, particularly the governance and security aspects of it, really is a company-wide effort to be successful. And when I started, there's all of those different inputs that the organization needs to, and it's multidisciplinary, right? And in really every sense of it. So the solution and approach needs to accommodate that, right? And the supporting technologies and overall governance and security strategy need to align with the organizational structure to be successful. We don't want to see organ rejection, and then the better alignment there, the flexibility to map to those, really critical to executing this well. Again, kind of our experience overwhelmingly is that crawl, walk, run deployment of this is extremely successful, meaning start with a use case, take your warnings, carry those forward as the platform continues to expand and adopt. That helps guide a lot of the decisions related to access management, but also broadly. And then lastly, I think as we in the community think about being data practitioners, helping develop kind of best practices across organizational boundaries, I would like to think about how the distributed stewardship concept that I talked about briefly can be extended across organizations. Meaning, is there a pattern that makes sense for companies within a vertical or companies of a different stage in their data platform, so we can formalize a little bit more how we learn from each other and build the data strategy for the organization. So with that, thank you. I'm certainly happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Nong Lee, there's been 3 questions that I put in the chat box. So let me go ahead and last 5 minutes. Question number 1, for the password in the comment field example, you stated its dynamic nature will fix the access for the future entities or entries. What about the old entries?
Yeah, so I think that's an example exactly where the static approaches get very, very complicated, right? So static approach to me means I have created a copy for you, and I didn't realize the comment field had a problem. So you have some derived copy where that is good, and the expectation for you is that's the copy you're supposed to read, right? It's a static copy designed for your use case. And then if I need to change it, I have to go track all of those down and regenerate them, right? So that's the issue. With the ABAC dynamic approach, it means that I can now, as the owner who has identified this comment field, add a tag to it, change its policy. Of course, what you read before, you've already read, but you're not making copies of those. So therefore, the next time this user queries it, we can apply redaction to that field.
Great. The second question was for the dynamic access policies. When enforcing the new policies in future queries, can't this break some pre-existing recurring queries?
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. And I think any robust solution would make sure that you have the right primitives so that you can minimize the impact. And then oftentimes the impact is completely alleviated. So for example, in a system like ours, we support referential preserving anonymization, right? So if you're joining on those values, you're still good. So that's not a problem. Most of our transformations, for example, can be type preserving so that they maintain compatibility, so on and so forth. So I think there's a range of techniques and ways to alleviate it. But yeah, certainly a concern, but I think solvable.
Excellent. And just the last question that we had come in here. Should someone hack into the process and add a new policy to allow other malicious actors, low-level people access? How difficult would that be to detect?
I think I missed the very first part of it. But
oh, so should someone hack into this process and added a new policy to allow other malicious actors, low-level people access, how difficult would that be to detect?
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, solutions like these need to have very robust auditing and things like that. But I would say this process can really simplify it. Again, kind of our core thesis is if you have hundreds or thousands of policies you're maintaining, one, you're there because they constantly need to change, right? So meaning the frequency of updates, even for the proper use, is going to be high. And then monitoring that or approving that is going to be its own set of error-prone challenges, right? With ABAC and this dramatic reduction in the number of policies and the number of times you need to update them really simplifies this problem. Now, of course, you still want to make sure you have proper monitoring and approval processes and so on, but it dramatically reduces, I think, the risk exposure.
Excellent. Just as an FYI, we were just doing some analytics there. We can't tell who, but we can tell approximate numbers. There are approximately about 200 to 250 people watching each one of our 4 concurrent sessions, even at this time of the evening. So on behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Symposium, Nong and Okera, we'd like to thank you. We hope that you will obviously hang around in the next couple of days to attend the other sessions, the other informative sessions, and we will be in touch with you in the coming days. But we'd like to thank you for your time and thank you for your sponsorship.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
It was a pleasure. We look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, Rupal and Nong. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.